I'm here with Jim Goolsby, and he just flew in Luke Zamperini in this plane. You're otherwise known as Pappy. Can you talk about what that flight was like?
It was cold. It was over water, and but it was smooth.
Okay.
That was about it.
Okay. What's it been like to fly this plane?
It's one of the harder airplanes I've flown. I've flown every Boeing aircraft except the new ones, but this airplane doesn't fly like a jet. It takes muscle. It takes a lot of planning. It is easy to break, and so you really have to be careful with it.
Okay, you flew in from where?
We came in from Santa Barbara.
How long was the flight?
Block to block, it was about 50 minutes.
Okay. And what was the flight like?
Well, it was. It started out kind of windy down up there, and then we got out over the water. It was very smooth. There was a low overcast of about 1,500 feet, and we were down at around 1,100. But it was kind of cold out there over the water. And then we went up near Catalina Island before we turned in and came into here.
Jim, can you tell us about the nose art on this plane?
This is pretty typical of a World War II bomber. This one represents a Witchcraft, which was an aircraft in the 8th Air Force flying out of England that flew 130 missions where no one was ever hurt or they never missed a mission. And that was pretty unusual. When the war was over with, she was brought back to the United States and went to Kingman, Colorado, and was destroyed. They had turned her into toasters and washing machines. The nose art on here is when we repainted the airplane to represent that, it was painted by the same NCO officer, sergeant that painted it in World War II. He came out, did the original nose art all over again. Each of the bombs on there represent a mission that was flown, and of course there's 130 of them on there.
How long have you been flying this?
Now, this is my 16th year I've been flying it, and it's a difficult airplane to fly for the most part, but you get used to its idiosyncrasies, and then she's a sweetheart. She does some things that some airplanes can't do. And
can you talk about that? So what are some of the things that this airplane can do that others can't?
If you're a little high on the approach and you need to lose altitude without gaining airspeed, it does the most beautiful side slip you've ever seen. And a lot of people think that's kind of wild looking, but the slab-sided fuselage acts like a great big speed brake, so it's pretty easy to fly.
Can you talk about some of the World War II vets that you've had on this plane with you? Some of the stories.
Lou Sabertini at one time, a number of years ago, but there's always been vets, one or another, out here, and they start telling you different stories, and they would all make a movie, every one of them. You know, it was uncommon valor was a common virtue, as one admiral said, and these stories get pretty wild. Some of them are funny, some of them are very sad. So.
Can you give us a closer-up look of the plane?
Okay. The engines on the B-24 are Pratt & Whitney 1830-65s. They put out about 1,200 horsepower. During the war, Pratt & Whitney and various companies built way over 320,000 engines just for the B-24 fleet. It's a what they call a radial engine. In other words, the cylinders on it are circular, and there are 14. There's 2 rows of 7. After we check the engines out, one of the things we do is we check the landing gear, and it's a pretty good piece of equipment. One of the things we look for is any hydraulic leaks and things like that. The tires on there, they have about 80 psi pressure on the inside, and they're pretty expensive. Brand new, they're $5,000 each. To recap them, they're around $1,500. But it's very easy to ruin one of these tires. This airplane has no anti-skid system on it, and if you really stomp on the brakes, you'll take the tread right off of it, right down to the threads. So when we checking it out, we always look and make sure that everything is properly aligned. There's no hydraulic leaks or anything like that, and we usually kick the tire. It gives a particular kind of thump, and you can tell if it's low or the pressure's low in it. The flaps on the B-24 are what they call Fowler flaps, and this is one of the first airplanes to ever use Fowler flaps. It gives the airplane a lot more lift at slower speeds. But up in the wing root and in that flap area is the flap actuator. It's a hydraulically operated system, and we have to make sure that it's not leaking. The wing on the B-24 is rather significant. It was the Davis airfoil and what they call a high aspect ratio wing, which is comparing the wingspan to the wing chord, and it makes a very efficient wing. The B-24 was actually about 20 miles an hour faster and carried more bombs than the B-17 simply because they had the same horsepower engines, but just because of the aerodynamics of the Davis wing and the flaps, it could go a lot faster. The B-24 was a little different. It had twin tails, twin vertical stabilizers and rudders, and which actually makes them pretty effective because there was always a rudder or a vertical stabilizer in the prop wash. And so if you lose an engine in a B-24, it's really very easy to keep it straight by just using a sufficient amount of rudder. The symbols on the B-24 tail usually represent the wing, the squadron, and the aircraft that was in there. So if another squadron happened to fly up alongside of you, another group flying alongside of you, they could recognize where you belonged simply by your tail code, as they called it. And in this particular case, it represents the Witchcraft in the 8th Air Force. This is the tail gun position. The tail gunner sat back there. To me, this is the most uncomfortable place in the whole airplane. The tail is always wiggling around quite a bit, and it's very uncomfortable to sit back there for any length of time. Those are 50 caliber guns. The airplane had 10 of them on the airplane at various positions, and it was electrically and hydraulically operated. It operates very fast. It'll move very quickly from one side to the other, and but it had a sight in there. They wouldn't spend the whole mission in there, but when they were in enemy territory and being attacked, of course, that's where the tail gunner sat. When you're flying on the B-24, the best ride in the house is the waist gun position. Lots of good views out there and what have you, but it's also probably the coldest place to sit. The little V-ane you see on the right of the hatch there is a wind deflector. When that's closed, it's a real hurricane breeze in there. You got to realize that this airplane at 25,000, 26,000 feet bombing altitudes was wide open. So the temperatures were down in minus 40, minus 50 degrees. And then you're standing there with the wind blowing on you at that temperature. It's very, very cold. A lot of the injuries in World War II was actually frostbite and also passing out from lack of oxygen. You had to wear an oxygen mask all the time when you were above 10,000 feet. And they had a little system where the crews would check out on the intercom everybody to make sure they were still wide awake and hadn't passed out from lack of oxygen. It happened with regularity you wouldn't believe. And I talked to some vets and so forth. Every one of them had passed out or had frostbite or something like that. One of the stories I like to add about the waist gun position is that until the very late models, there was no control safeties on the guns. And occasionally one of them would go off and they'd hit the airplane itself, which was very easy to do with the vertical tail. And mechanics would sometimes write little notes on the inside of the tail saying, "Shoot here for half pay." And it happened with regularity, unfortunately. Right now we're in the business end of the B-24. This is the Bombe. It's rather large compared to a B-17 and was the biggest one until the B-29 came out. Those bombs you see on their side are replicas of a typical 500-pound general-purpose bomb. We could carry as many as 12 of those. It could carry 2,000-pounders. It could carry 4 of those. And it could carry up to 96 incendiaries. So it was a pretty capable airplane at the time. You notice there's a lot of hoses and pipes and wires in here. These were kind of exposed to the, to gunfire and what have you. but there are fuel lines, hydraulic lines, and the cables are the controls for the flight controls. The wing at the very top up here, that's where the fuel was kept inside. These are fuel boost pumps right here. And during the war, my dad worked on these. He was a mechanic in the Pacific, and the airplane had a very bad reputation of being a fuel leaker. The fuel lines back then were not really up to standard, you might say, but that had a lot of leaks. The design was the problem more than anything. All the controls, wiring and everything, all this stuff that you see on these walls were actually put on the walls before it was even put on the airplane, and jigs and what have you. And so these airplanes snapped together real quick. I had a supervisor tell me at the San Diego plant they could actually assemble a B-24 in 2 days. They were coming off the production line one every 55 minutes. They built 18,600 of them, and they were mostly built by women. And Rosie the Riveter is what they called her. It happened to be my stepmother was one. She worked at Willow Run, and my mom worked on them. She worked for Pan American at the time during the war, and she was what they call a rib stitcher. She would actually stitch the cotton onto the control surfaces. Okay, right now we're in the aft section of the aircraft. That's the tail gun position back there, tail turret. Ammo used to be kept in these wooden boxes right here, and they would go down the chute to under the gun. They carried about 1,000 rounds per gun on most missions. The yellow bottles right here are oxygen bottles. These are typical of the time, but there was a lot more of them in the airplane. And this is where they got their breathing oxygen from at altitude. If you can see the black can all the way in the back there, that's the toilet. These airplanes could stay in the air for a long time. This airplane itself had one mission that was over 18 hours long, and needless to say, that's a long time. I don't know if you can see it or not, but there is a funnel right there with a hose on it. That was where the pilots would urinate. And we had a Rosie the Riveter out here that could remember the part number of that funnel. Strange things. But anyway, when we're back here and doing a pre-flight and what have you, we're looking for hydraulic leaks. We make sure all the cables and so forth are running right and nothing's getting in their way. Right here is the belly turret, and it's in the retracted position. This airplane, it retracts and extends. That's because it sits so close to the ground. If it was extended, it'd only have about 3 inches before it hit the ground. The way that it worked is basically to get the gunner in there, they would use switches to point the guns down, and that would expose a hatch that would come right up into this area right here. And then the gunner would get in, and they would secure the hatch, and then the whole thing extends down with that hydraulic actuator. That's part of his oxygen system above it. There was also a way to retract it manually if something happened. But they could not land with this thing extended. Occasionally they did do it, but usually there was a lot of damage on there. If the airplane got into real trouble and they were trying to make it back to base and they had lost like 2 engines or something like that, they could actually jettison this. And it wasn't an easy deal. They had to get out some wrenches and so forth. It took about 15 minutes. But they could drop 1,500 pounds. That's how much it weighs. And needless to say, they would get the gunner out first. But occasionally that did happen. This is the waist position, the waist gunner position. These were 50 cal. They're very maneuverable on there. And they would get all their ammo from belts and boxes forward of their position. It was cold here. It was windy. But when they were not in combat or away from combat areas, they could actually close these hatches. The guns could fold back against the side, and they could close these hatches and fly the airplane rather comfortably with the hatches closed. These little green bottles that you see right here, they're known as walk-around bottles. At altitude, when they were on oxygen, if something happened, they would go from one position to another by plugging into that little green bottle, and they had about 5 minutes worth of oxygen in there. Also, you'll see around here in different places a little black box, usually right here. This little black box was kind of neat because at altitude it was very cold. These gentlemen had electrically heated underwear. They called them bunny suits because they were light blue in color. They were electrically heated, and that's where they would plug them in. And there's a little rheostat on that box that allows them to adjust the temperature. Sometimes they had hot spots, always in the wrong spot. What you're looking at now is the way that the nose gunner and bombardier and navigator would get to their position in the nose of the airplane. That main structure you see right in the middle is actually the landing gear extension system. The batteries for the airplane are on our left-hand side. Also a little item called the putt-putt, which was the auxiliary power unit. You notice that there's a lot of cables, a lot of tubes and pipes and stuff in this area. But that was the way they would get to the nose section of the airplane. 3 men were up there, the bombardier, the navigator, and the nose gunner. We're behind the cockpit right now. We're in the section where the top turret gunner would be and the radio operator. And the top turret gunner was also the aircraft flight engineer. He was the main NCO in charge of the airplane for maintenance and so forth. And usually he was a master sergeant or something like that, chief NCO. All the other gunners on the airplane were at least buck sergeants. But he was the one that the aircraft commander would say, okay, make out the maintenance forms, and he would make sure that the airplane was properly serviced and all maintenance items were covered by the ground crews. Back here is the electrical panel. The airplane had 4 generators in World War II. Up here is the fuel panel. That's you could cross-feed the fuel from one engine to another or across the airplane. And also these are the fuel gauges right here. And they're basically just level gauges. They just showed what the level was in each tank. If you look up, this is the top turret gunner's position. It's kind of difficult to get in and out, but the way they did it was that this bottom seat right here is actually like a hatch. It would drop down, the gunner would get up in there, and then another crew member would close it, and he would control it from up there. On to the left is where the radio operator sat. And the radios in this airplane are original, and they work. Even after all these years, they are still working. Some people like to think this is where the heroes all sat. This is the cockpit, and it is very much original as the original World War II B-24. If a veteran got up in here today, he would look at this and it would be exactly what he saw in World War II. On our left-hand side of the aircraft commander's position, these are the flight instruments: artificial horizon, gyro, directional gyro, turn and bank, airspeed, altimeter, and a PDI, which was a pilot direction indicator. The bombardier would use him to tell go left or right. A rate of climb indicator. These are aircraft engine instruments right here. You notice that the airplane has 4 engines, but it only has 2 instruments. And actually, there's 2 needles on one gauge. So this is for engines number 1 and 2. This is for engines number 3 and 4. RPM gauge, same thing, number 1 and 2, number 3 and 4. These lights right here, those are the gear indicators. They tell us that the gear is down and locked. If they're out with battery power on, it means that the gear is not down and it is not locked. It's either all the way up or it's down and locked, period. This is where the autopilot panel was at. The autopilot in this airplane doesn't work anymore, and so what we did was we fixed it so we could put all our modern radios in there. But if a vet came up here and he looked at this, this is exactly what it would look like. All the engine instruments, you'll notice, fuel pressures, oil pressures, temperatures, and what have you, are on the co-pilot side. And he did most of that, kept most of the engine's parameters, and he kept most of the engines operating properly. And these are fuel boost pumps, pre-oilers. These are the start switches, things like that. These levers right here are the mixture controls for the carburetor. Right now they're in what they call the idle cutoff position. But for starting, they would go to lean, and then for takeoff, they'd be in rich position, and then in cruise, they'd be back in the lean position. In cruise, the airplane is burning not quite 200 gallons an hour. At takeoff power, it's burning 637 gallons an hour. So you can see this is a real guzzler. This switch right here is the emergency backup motor for the hydraulic system. These are the cowl flaps that control the cooling of the cylinders, and they're toggle-loaded switches so you can operate them. These are the throttles, the same as the gas lever on a car, or gas pedal. And these are the turbocharger handles. The turbochargers use the exhaust off the engine to spin a turbine, which shoves more air into the carburetor, so you can maintain sea level pressure up to high altitude, and with that you're able to maintain horsepower at higher altitudes. The prop RPM is governed with these switches right here. They are an electric switch that operates the prop governor, which is operated by engine oil. This is the Achilles heel of the B-24. During the war, I have a picture of my father working on B-24s, and what's he working on? He's working on a prop governor. But anyway, basically you move this switch here, it changes a little electric motor out on the engine that governs how much oil is going to the prop hub, and thus what the RPM of the engine is. These are intercoolers, pitot heat, and then again, of course, the cowl flaps. This is the trim tab control for the rudder trim. This right here is the aileron trim for trimming out the control surfaces. And this is the elevator trim. We use this a lot on this airplane. And down here is the landing gear lever. And over here is the flap lever. You notice they have a different handle. It was very possible, and happened a number of times, where a pilot would call for gear up and the co-pilot might pull the flaps up, or he might call for gear down and he might put the flaps down. That was one reason why they changed the condition of these handles, the shape of these handles. This red switch red handle right here, T-switch, this was a Bombe servo. If they got in trouble at high weight right after takeoff, they could reach down, pull this handle. It would automatically open the Bombe doors and salvo all the bombs overboard. This is a control lock. It locks the controls while the airplane's not flying on the ground and keeps them from banging around. The parking brake is right here.